There's only one circle at the bottom.
Yeah, I think they've probably done it now.
Okay. At some point, Andy, it'd be useful if you could just work out who we're expecting, and therefore, when we sort of everyone's here, we think is going to be here.
Keeping a log of who switches on when they switch on.
Okay. What I'm probably going to do, folks, is try and sort of share my screen so you can sort of see the papers as I'm going through them. So apologies for the technological fumbling that will no doubt entail, but hopefully it'll work reasonably okay.
As if, Tim, it's absolutely perfect.
Yeah. I think perfect's not the word that will come to mind once you've experienced the meeting. But, you know, we'll see. I suppose we should at least wait for Sue, because obviously she's chairing this.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
I just got a decline from Heather, so we won't be getting Heather.
Okay.
I think she's probably might be pulled off to something else.
Okay, that's fine. I'll suggest we just wait until Sue's here and then we'll make a start. To invite Sue on. Have you just seen the email there come through?
Yeah.
You can do that yourself.
I'll have a go.
Sue, Andy?
Well, I've just resent it.
Tim?
Yes.
Sorry, I don't know if you've just seen the chat I just put on, but we're getting really quite awful feedback. I don't know if it'd be better if everybody just mutes to start with, but I'm getting a really awful sound.
Yeah, it's gone quiet for me now, but I know what you mean. It sounded a bit like it was we were in the loo or something, or someone was making a flushing noise, something like that, wasn't it? So yeah, if people can try and do that. So if you're not speaking, if you can try and mute yourself. I mean, it sounds okay for me now, having said that, so hopefully it'll go on okay. I think most people are here who expect to be here now, Andy. So shall we make a start?
Is Sue joined?
I've got an SB at the bottom, so I'm guessing that's you, Sue.
Ah.
Yes, I have, thank you. Excellent. I was trying to get in.
Yes. Yeah. All right then. So we start by apologies, Andy.
Yeah, I've got. I had a few apologies, but it seems people have turned up, so thanks for that. I've got Rachel Cook as an apology. I'm guessing Heather's got Heather's apology because she just declined at the very last moment, and so has Tracy Smart. But apart from that, hopefully everyone should be here.
Okay. Now, I know. I think for you, Darren, this is your first form, isn't it?
Yeah,
so
this is my first
just
one.
Want to
Yeah.
introduce yourself?
Yeah. So my name's Darren Lennon. So I've got 2 roles. I'm the head teacher of the Linden Centres. So we've got the mini, the primary, the secondary, and the hub. And also I am the behaviour support advisory team lead with Typhon and Rikim.
Okay, Darren. Nice to have you on the form. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And Robert, have you been to the form before?
I've been trying to for about a year, I think, Tim, to be fair, but I finally made it.
Because I'm sure you've been a member, so I was thinking, should I say? Because I'm not sure, but I just didn't remember you being here. So I'm sure people know who you are. But do you want to just introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Robert Fox. Yeah, hello, I'm Robert Fox. I'm the head teacher at Donington Junior School in very sunny Donington.
Yeah, sunny, not sunny where I am, tell you. Right, is there anyone else who hasn't been before? Don't think there is, but please say if
I'm here in Rachel Cook's absence, just to represent Central Cluster. So I'm Linda Stolick, head teacher of Randley.
Thanks, Linda.
Okay.
Right, shall we go on to well, I'm sorry, I'm taking over Sue's role. So it's over to you now, Sue. Item 2. Are you muted as well?
It's not helpful, is it?
There you go.
We'll go through the minutes of the previous meeting. Sorry, it's been a bit of a challenge this morning, trying to get into the meeting when there was no invite for me.
Yeah.
Okay. Has anybody got any comments on page 1?
Can I just say, by the way, I wasn't originally intending to share documents, but Andy said I shouldn't be showing documents because otherwise people can't see everyone who's attending. Is that right, Andy?
Yeah, we've all got to be viewable, so whoever's watching can actually see who's speaking.
Okay.
Any comments on page 2? 3? No.
On page 2.
Pardon?
On page 2.
Yeah.
Jill, can you give us an update on the post 16? Because you're going to have a chat with Graham Guest. Do you want to unmute?
Yes, I think we'll have somebody ready for beginning of for the next meeting from Telford College. I think it might be the finance director, but he's going to confirm that with me. But we will have somebody.
Okay, thanks, Jill.
Any other comments? Okay, so over back to you.
Okay, just to point out, by the way, the minutes you've just been looking at are a long time ago now. They're in January. We normally have a March meeting, which we cancel because one's a huge amount on the agenda. So we intended to cover that in May, and then of course the May meeting got cancelled as well, given circumstances. So we sort of had to have one now because we do have to have a minimum, I think, 4 meetings a year. I think that's right, Andy.
Yeah.
So we do have to abide by this. And the DFE, just for your information, has issued some guidance on what we need to do. And the reason we're streaming this on YouTube is, I think as you're aware, the forum has to be a public meeting. So it's got to be something that should anyone want to watch it, they can in the same way as you would do in a real meeting. So as we were saying before the meeting starts, I think the chances of there being millions of the public out there watching us as we speak is pretty slim. But at least in theory, we are all now on YouTube, and I gather from my IT colleague, it'll be sort of saved in sort of perpetuity on YouTube. So should you ever want to come back and see this in a decade's time, then in theory it'll be there. Scary thought.
Oh God.
Anyway, right. Okay, so back to the agenda then. So item 3 is DSG Outturn 2019-20. Andy, do you want to say something?
Yeah, can I just go back to the page 3 of the minutes?
Yeah.
Rachel at the last meeting asked for something to be produced around early years about traded and untraded.
Yeah.
Liz Smith's coming to the September forum because she's got the presentations and everything ready, but she wanted to actually present it to you. So rather than doing it at this meeting, she's going to come in September. If that's okay.
All right, thanks, Andy. Forgot about that. Is there anything else before I plough on? Okay. Right, so I think the next item on the agenda is DSG outturn 2019-20. So because of the timing of this meeting, we've shut down the account, so all that is done. So as you'll be aware, we in the last few years we didn't really pay a huge amount of attention to DSG overall position because it fluctuated a bit, but there wasn't any fundamental problem with DSG. And the last few years there has been quite a fundamental problem with the DSG around high needs. And you're no doubt aware nationally this has been an issue, and for a number of local authorities they've been incurring multi-million-pound deficits. So we haven't quite got to that, but a couple of years ago, as you'll see in 1.2, we'd moved from a £271,000 surplus at the end of 2016-17 to a £544,000 deficit at the end of 17-18, and we're obviously pretty concerned by that because that was an £800,000 sort of turnaround in a single year. Since then, we've sort of managed to keep it under pretty good control, really, particularly in 18-19. We cleared the deficits at a small surplus, and at the end of 19-20, we marginally increased the surplus. So bearing in mind DSG in Telford, in total, it's something like, what is it now, 160 million, something like that? It's a lot of money anyway. But so in the context of that, 120,000 is nothing really. But I think the main point is we have avoided a deficit, which is better than many other local authorities. There's a caveat to that, of course, which is that on the one hand, you see in 1.3 I've given ourselves a bit of a pat on the back, which feels a bit wrong as I'm writing it, but I thought I should do really. But it is worth pointing out also that no matter what we do in this area of high needs, we're constrained really by what the government does. So they determine the funding and they set the legislative parameters. And one of the reasons, or the main reason that high needs has had problems in recent years is because of the actions the government has taken with regard to funding and the parameters. So there's no guarantee that we won't have some sort of issues in the future. But so far, again, compared to other areas, we've done remarkably well, I think, to keep it under some sort of control. So one sort of indication of the problem with DSG is when the DFE start changing the rules. So at the moment, we now have a situation where the DFE can ask local authorities to provide them with information and cooperate with them and do recovery plans, etc., if either they have a deficit or if the surplus gets significantly worse in a year. So they've given themselves quite significant powers to intervene should they feel the need in almost any authority. We at this point aren't subject to that because our deficit has gone up. But in theory, even if our surplus has gone up, but in theory, even if we had got a surplus, if that surplus declined significantly in a year, the DFE could still intervene. So they have given the power to sort of step in sort of quite a lot of circumstances. The other thing they have changed is that you might remember a couple of years ago when we had a deficit, we actually asked your approval to carry that forward against DSG. Well, that's because the default used to be a DSG deficit goes against general fund, unless the form says otherwise. Well, the reverse is now the case. So a DSG deficit continues to be held against DSG unless the Secretary of State decides otherwise. There'll be a bit more about that in another paper, which is sort of separated out. And then they've just finished by saying on the DSG sort of council bit that we have had a sort of an overall sort of policy approach for the last couple of years, which is to try and make sort of mainstream schools more resilient and try and support mainstream schools to be inclusive, because we know mainstream schools have had their own budget difficulties and particular challenges around high needs. So we've been trying to sort of do a bit of a juggling that really, because as I'm sure you're aware, we can't not fund special schools appropriately, for example. So we have to continue doing that. There are more children in special schools now, so that creates its own pressure. What we've tried to avoid doing is put all the money into the sort of the higher need institutions and neglect mainstream institutions. So we've tried to balance the two by giving some mainstream schools some more support as well. So far, financially, that sort of worked for us because, as I say, we've managed to live within our means. But it's not to sort of diminish the pressures that I'm sure many of you have experienced in your own schools in managing high needs. So we'll have to see how it goes, but I don't think any of us expects the underlying sort of demographics which are driving high needs pressures to diminish anytime soon. So it will continue to be an area of challenge for us. I'm going to go on to maintain schools balance in a moment. So any questions or comments on that first bit? Okay, thank you. I'll press on then. So just to emphasise, this next bit is maintain school balances, because we do have significant academy presence now, particularly, most of the secondary sector is academies now. So this is only talking about maintain school balances. So how are maintained schools doing in terms of balances? Well, just over 7 million. That does include 3 million of single status. So a big chunk of the 7 million is single status money, which I'm sure will provide an opportunity for the odd comment in a moment. So in terms of how that had moved, it's gone up a little bit, about $250,000. But if you look at capital, that had gone down by about 300 grand. So overall then, very stable position for school balances in the maintained sector. And partly in that context, partly because, as we all know, we're still in the midst of the impact of COVID. Then we've decided not to carry out a full balances survey this year. So the LA does have the right to contact all schools with a balance of more than 8% maintained schools, or 5% if you maintain secondary, and challenge the school on why they're holding those balances. So we haven't done a full-blown survey this time. We've just written to schools where we looked at the 2021 budget. It didn't look like the balance was going to go down significantly, and they're already above the threshold. We've had replies from, I think, about 4 schools we wrote to, all of which we thought were satisfactory. So that will be an end of it. We didn't think now was really a good time to be putting too much pressure on the schools, given that none of us are quite sure what the ongoing impact will be on schools of the continuing sort of impact of COVID. All right then, is any comments on any of that?
Can I just ask about whether we're ever going to do anything with the single status money?
Yeah, I wonder whether I get away with it this time, but
I'm not going to let you get away with it, Tim.
You're really
I don't want to get through a school's forum meeting without us discussing it,
No, I saw Sue's face. I thought if no one says anything, Sue definitely will. I think she's politely waiting for someone else. So you stepped into the breach, Jill. Yes, well, this is a pertinent point because I think it was a year ago, I might be mistaken there, but we certainly had debated the possibility of putting, because a chunk of this money, 50,000 is sort of central schools money put aside about 10 or 12 years ago. Yeah. We had debated the possibility of that money being diverted elsewhere, maybe to high needs, because it would then at least be spent on children as opposed to sitting there waiting for single status to be done. And we sort of decided, I think, or we've put it off to A, have a look at how high needs was doing, and B, see how single status was progressing. I mean, single status is still progressing. We've got a local scheme now. I'm not sure we've got to the stage of consulting with unions, but if we're not there, we think we're getting fairly close to that point. So there is progress, albeit not particularly rapid, towards this reaching a conclusion. But again, the last data saw was still a little while away for potential implementation. Would the forum like someone to give you an update on single status at the next meeting?
Not really.
I'm trying to get myself off the hook here, Jill. So yes.
I mean,
a little change messages you'll have gathered from what I've been saying for a number of years now.
Because the point for us is, Tim, and this is a purely selfish learning community trust issue, is when we converted our schools, obviously you've still got any money that was removed from school budgets or held back for single status. So that's part of my rationale, is to say, can I get my hands on the cash, or if we're going to contribute to the whole around high needs, then I'll happily contribute to that. But it would be useful maybe moving forward to have a better plan for what we're going to do with this, because it's just like you say, 12 years old. It's been sitting there a long time, and
yeah. I take your point, because Jill's point, just for those of you who are maybe not aware, is when we put aside because as I say, of this 3 million, about 650,000 is sort of central schools money. And when I say that, it means the forum in, I think it was 2008-9, 2009-10, in each of those 2 years put aside £300,000 from overall school monies. Now at that point, the only academies in Telford, I think, were probably Abraham, Derby, and Madeley, I think.
Yeah.
So all the other schools were putting part of their own money into this, including schools which are subsequently converted. And single status doesn't apply to academies. It doesn't technically apply, I should say, by the way, to voluntary aided schools either, or foundation schools, because they technically are the employer of the staff. The other complications at the time, we'd sort of assumed, because single status would apply to the vast bulk of schools in Telford, that even if it didn't technically apply to your school, you would feel obligated to implement it to avoid the staff in most of the schools having better terms and conditions. Now, you could argue that since that time, with more foundation schools, more academies, that situation isn't quite the same. So it might or might not be the case that everyone feels the need to mirror single status when it comes in. I don't know. But either way, the situation, it's not surprising that, it's a long time ago now, more than 10 years, and the situation has changed somewhat.
Yeah.
I mean, what I would suggest is if this is still an issue for the forum, in terms of there is at least a significant portion of you feel that we should maybe look to do something else with this money, then maybe we should get someone to give an update on single status, and then maybe in that context decide what to do. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah.
Okay. So the next meeting or the one after, so sometime in the autumn, we'll invite someone with a single status sort of team or managing it, the process, to come along, describe where we are, and then maybe in that context the forum can take a view.
Sounds good.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on the paper? No? Okay, I'll move on to the next one, which is treatment of DSG deficits, which is connected really to what I've just been talking about, and I've touched on some of this already. So I'll go through this pretty quickly. So again, there's a bit of context, and actually comes back to me that when I think in 2018 we had a deficit and we asked the forum to carry it forward against DSG. There was a chap from the ESFA actually attended the forum that day, for those of you there, and did make a point of saying to the forum, hey guys, you do actually realise that you need to approve this, otherwise it will go against the LA's monies. So that was jolly helpful of him from the LA's point of view. Unfortunately, the forum nonetheless decided it was only fair to carry it forward against DSG. Anyway, but that's the thing that's now changed. So DSG deficit stays with DSG, which seems reasonable, I think. The background to that is, well, quoting 1.4, some local authority chief finance officers concluded that if their DSG account is in deficit, they need to be able to cover the deficit from the authority's general reserves. We noted similar views held by organisations that audit local authority accounts. Given the size of some authorities' DSG deficits, there is a risk that covering DSG deficits from general funds may lead authorities to make spending reductions in other services that they would not otherwise make. So that's why the DFE has changed the rules. Because if you're a council with a £10 million DSG deficit, even if your chief finance officer was relaxed about it, the auditors would be saying, well, legally, you're on the hook for this. And therefore, when we're looking at your financial position, we're assuming you're on the hook for 10 million quid. And therefore, the finance officer could then be in a position where they've got to make further cuts to LA services to get out of this position. So that sort of forced the DFE's hand on this one. So I've said that it's changed the position. The other stuff that you might be interested in is the overall position of authorities on DSG, because I said we're doing relatively well. So in 1.3, just going back a bit, the DFE said in January, at the end of 2018-19, about half of all authorities experienced an overspend amounting to £250 million in all. Half authorities 75, give or take. That's about £3 million deficit on average, i.e. quite a lot of money. The national net position was an overspend of £40 million, and authorities were forecasting it would be a net overspend of £230 million at the end of 2019-20. So in other words, overall, there was still a small surplus because some authorities were in surplus, some in deficits, but that position was expected to reverse. So the situation is sort of progressively getting more difficult for authorities, despite, you'll notice, more money going to high needs in recent years. So despite more money going in, it's still getting more difficult. And then the other bit which I thought we'd be interested in is that you might remember a year or two back, perhaps a year ago or so, the DFE sort of went back to a sort of 3-year budget for schools. So those of you who've been doing this a while might remember that there was a period of time when you used to get 2 or 3 year budgets for schools, at least nationally. And then in recent years, it's gone back to an annual process. I mean, for me personally, multi-year budgets were helpful because it gave you something to plan around. So they went back to that, but they did it in the totality of the school's funding. And in the current world, it's not just the totality that's interesting, it's where the money's directed. Is it high schools? Is it high needs, early years? So they said in January that they referred to the increase in monies, but they also said that it will need to be split between schools and high needs. And in making that decision, we'll be mindful of the pressures on high needs. So I take that as meaning that there's likely to be more money going to high needs in the next couple of years. But the more they do that, the less will then go into schools block. The bit that I found sort of I was a bit twitchy about was that they said, and this may have been sort of postponed because of the COVID impact, we'll see. We intend to review the funding form for high needs over the next year or two, and in doing so, we will take account of the patterns of expenditure that LA's deficits, alongside other evidence, will help to identify and what they tell us about LA's need to spend. As part of the review, we will identify any changes needed to the current formula so that it reflects LA's need to spend. Now, this is written in DFE speak, which is carefully ambiguous. But I read that as saying that if you're an authority and you're spending shed loads more than we're actually giving you, we'll take the easy option and give you more money, which would be, from our point of view, a very galling outcome. Because, you know, if you spent your time and effort trying to keep DSG under some sort of budgetary control, to then face the prospect of other authorities who haven't done that getting more money because they spent more would be a little frustrating. Now, whether they mean that or not, as you say, it's carefully ambiguous. But certainly in the past, when I've been to conferences and, you know, I and others have said to the DFE, what are you doing? Just base high needs on demographics. You know, it's up to local authorities to sort it out beyond that. You know, you just take account of population side, you know, deprivation, etc. Work out a formula, give it to authorities, they deal with it. They've always shied away from it because of basically politics. It means some authorities gaining a fair amount and some authorities losing a fair amount. And the way they square the circle is they base a big chunk of it on historical spend. And it does suggest to me that they're not intending to depart from that approach, which, as I say, potentially will be a bit galling for us. I'm not quite saying we should spend in order to gamble that we get more cash out of them, but, you know, it's hardly a sort of an incentive to, you know, manage your own resources. So it's all speculative, but I just thought it would be interesting just for you to get a bit of the sort of mood music around this, as a sort of feel for what may happen. All right, any comments or queries on that?
Tim, just a question. When do you get notification then of your high needs?
December.
December, yeah.
Yeah, it's normally just before Christmas.
Yeah.
So around about the 18th of December, normally 18th of December, they give it to us. You sometimes get a bit of a sort of a hint or some of it a couple of months before. It depends how they go about it, but it's not until December you actually know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any more? Shall I press on? So the next paper is financial impacts of COVID-19 on schools. So obviously this is a live issue for everyone. I'm sort of summarising here the first bit of the paper, what I think you probably all know, but just to run through it. So in terms of the financial impacts, the ones that occurred to me, you may be thinking of others, is that the grant funding fundamentally stayed in place. So school funding fundamentally has been unaffected. However, if you generate private income from nursery provision over and above funded hours, or from before and after school provisions, or renting out premises, that sort of thing, in most cases that's been severely reduced, and by severe, you know, either pretty much disappeared or gone down by 80%, that sort of severe reduction. Whereas staff costs have pretty much continued as per normal. For maintained schools, that goes back to if we're, because we're considered the ultimate employer of staff, then we make the decision whether or not schools can furlough, and the council's decision was schools couldn't furlough. The context is the central government were clearly expecting authorities not to furlough. In their view, they're given authorities support, and therefore they shouldn't need to. I think they probably felt the same about schools as well. Worth noting, even if the decision had been made that schools could furlough, the actual impact of that might have been limited, because you can't furlough someone from one of two jobs. So if you've got a TA, for example, supports before and after provision, you couldn't furlough the before and after bit and not furlough the TA bit. So the potential for doing this in practice might have been more limited than would first appear. In terms of school costs, most I think have continued at pretty much a similar level. There's been a modest reduction in catering charges if you use our catering. If you use others, may or may not be the case. You might have saved some money in consumable expenditure just because fewer kids were in for much of the term. On the other side, probably in many cases, be increases in costs of equipment, additional cleaning costs, and maybe some other stuff as well. You'll be aware that the DfE's put a scheme in place to claim additional funding for costs, but it is quite restrictive in terms of what it allows you to do. It's really focused on premises costs mainly and additional cleaning. A bit for free school meals if they're not covered by the voucher scheme. And they put maximum amounts that schools are able to claim, range from 25 grand for a single entry primary school to 75 grand if you've got over 1,000 pupils. What we've seen so far, most schools have found that when they look at the limitations in place, the amount they feel they can actually claim within this scheme's limitations is not very much. We've been encouraging schools at least to try, because if you don't ask, you don't get. And from my point of view, you imagine there's, I don't know how many schools are in England, 20-odd thousand, something like that, a lot of schools. So the DfE is getting 20-odd thousand claims in. I could be incorrect here, but I imagine the amount of attention they spent, they applied for each of these claims is going to be fairly limited. So, I feel that if you might as well have a go, and if it appears to fit in within the parameters of the scheme, there's a fair chance you might get something out of it. Perhaps I shouldn't be saying this in a public meeting on YouTube, but hey ho. But that would be my approach. That if you don't ask, you don't get. So whilst it is quite restricted, if you've got something that you think might fit into one of these categories, you might as well sort of at least have a go for it. I mean, most schools I think will have incurred some extra costs as a result of this. So if there's help out there, why not have a go? In terms of the LA sort of impact position on this, because some schools have asked, particularly around furloughing, because that was the LA's decision. And if they've been, the schools have been running significant private provision, then they could be paying staff costs and not getting much of any income. So we've taken the view that we're not sort of definitively shutting the door, but we would want to have a look at the school's overall financial position, probably at the end of the summer term, and then take a view of it. There's one or two schools which I do think have been hard hit, and we will have to think about what we do. But for other schools, it may be that the net overall impact is fairly modest. But I wouldn't want to go about saying that definitively until we can actually see. So at the moment, it's a sort of holding position in the LA. We'll just have to see how things look at the end of the term. And by then, of course, we will also have a view as to, when schools are open in September for all pupils, whether from a financial point of view, that means financial normality resumes, or whether that's not the case. I'm thinking, for example, for special schools in particular, I'm quite clear in my own mind what exactly the government thinks is going to happen. I think there's maybe more guidance coming out, but whether that guidance is anything more than, here's some guidelines over to you folks. I'm sure you'll sort it out. Good luck out there, etc. We'll have to see. But whilst I can sort of envisage, say, primary school complying with the guidance, sort of how that would sort of work, I'm not sure it's quite as clear to me how that would work in a special school, for example. There may be other issues with the schools as well. So as I say, overall financially, I wouldn't say I'm 100% clear about whether the impact is going to sort of stop for this term and then be back to normal next term, or whether it'll still be, at least in some cases, quite significant. So we'll have to see.
Tim, just come in there. One of the things we're doing is trying to think about what we need in September, because I think we can submit a claim next week, 16th of July, for COVID expenses. So we're just trying to order stuff now then, so that we can ready for September, because they said there might be another window to claim.
They did, that's right.
That's all a bit, that could be pulled. So we're just saying whatever we need for September, like 30 gallons of sanitizer, we've got that in our, we're ordering it all now.
I think that's very wise.
Because I don't trust them not to just, because it's really scary in the guidance when they're really saying there is no money for schools to operate these new procedures. They're expecting you to work, which is totally unrealistic when you're trying to look at additional cleaning, And if we're going to spend thousands of pounds on sanitizer and tissues and goodness, there are additional expenses. There's beyond
that's right.
shadow of a doubt.
Yeah.
So I just advise people to front load it so you get your claims in.
And I think it's a good point, Jill, because next term all these things will be for all pupils. So whereas you will have been incurring costs for this term, that's probably for a small fraction of your total number of pupils. So once you ramped up to being full, all these sort of consumable type items, the usage of them will, multiply many times.
Yeah, exactly. So and I think with special schools, it's another challenge as well. I don't know what Heather thinks, but it's a different population of children in a different setting. So we're having a look at that at the moment.
Yeah, and from our point of view, we're still, debating what exactly it will mean, for example, for school transport.
Yeah.
Because I mean, the DFE, as I understand it, floated the idea, for example, in secondary schools of having sort of bubbles, which would be sort of year group bubbles, that sort of thing. But we don't transport pupils in year groups on buses. Now in Telford, we don't, apart from special schools, we don't have an enormous amount of bus transport to schools, but we do have some.
Yeah.
Well, immediately that will breach the bubbles. So whether the government view is, well, everyone has to wear a mask on the buses and that suffices, or is there still meant to be some sort of social distancing on buses, which would obviously be very difficult for us logistically because it would multiply the number of buses, etc., which may or may not be in place, etc. So there's still stuff around sort of the practicalities of implementing September, which, as I say, is still not crystal clear.
I think we had a debate, Vic, Jill, you were in the meeting, regarding sort of whether school transport actually came within that sort of government guidance, and I think it was decided that perhaps it wasn't. And I know there was a debate yesterday at the strategic meeting about secondary school transport.
I can't see practically how it could be, really. Because physically, it just may not be the transport around to transport people if you have to do multiple, runs to schools. There's no spare capacity necessarily.
I think the bus companies are already saying that. So I think you're right. It'll be face masks, and it might be they're talking about, year 7 at the front of the bus, then year 8. So it's almost they're in a bit of their bubbles. But
and you could have a gap of a seat or something maybe to create that.
No, I don't think anybody's got their head around it yet.
No. Heather, I think you've got your hand up.
Well, to just really reiterate what people have said, really, from a special school point of view, we've got children who won't be wearing face masks, so transport's going to be extremely complex. But if we don't find some way of matching up to the school bubbles, it makes a little bit of a mockery that you can't share a pencil, but you could sit on a bus for an hour with somebody who's not in your bubble. So to me, it is a really essential one that the government has got to try to look at and address if we are going to try to uphold the principles of the guidance. And I think there are lots of hidden costs of making sure that rooms have got water, cleaning. The guidance talks about, if a child gets sent home with a symptom, you've got to clean. Well, how do you do that when you've got a class full of children? How do you clean your resources? So I think there are many hidden costs, particularly for children who've got complex special needs.
I agree.
Not that I'm warning you about our budget deficit, Tim, in advance, but there will be one.
Yeah, it's just called a softening up process, I think.
It is.
Starts early on and continues through the year. Yeah, I do think, as I say, for certain schools, this becomes more difficult to envisage quite how it's going to work. But as I say, some of it, I suppose, we'll have to wait and see, A, what the government says, and B, how it works out in practice. And of course, the other thing is how the virus progresses. I mean, if it's sort of, by September, it's further sort of diminished to a very low level. I think the context for schools and everyone is rather different than if it continues to either bubble along or we have, upsurges to some extent, which is perfectly possible. And of course, the parental confidence, that will also be impacted by the general situation. How willing parents are to, send their children to school in whatever circumstances there are.
It's compulsory. School is compulsory, Tim.
Oh no, yeah. Well,
that's the edict.
Yeah. I know that's the government's line. Yeah. All right. Anything else on COVID financial consequences that people would like to comment on?
Tim, I just would like to just add as well, you know, we're still in positions where we may have staff who are not in. I was reading the NHS guidance and we've had a member of staff that's had to self-isolate for 2 weeks before an operation, and I believe family members may.
Yeah.
So significant implications for cover if you have to maintain your staff pupil ratio purely for safety before you even think about learning, let alone the organisational implication. The same with duplication of resources in part. If you have zones or bubbles, and it makes it difficult to, you know, necessarily share some of those things. So I do think there are many hidden things. And the other issue for us is if everybody can stagger starts, I mean, in our case, we've got staff who've probably got children in every single school in the borough, more or less. If everybody ends up on a different stagger and they've got to take their children to school later or earlier, well, when you then apply that back to a school that's got everybody in this, you know, across the borough, that is going to make organisational staffing issues extremely complex and difficult. And I don't know whether that's a financial thing or whether that's an organisational thing, because I haven't worked it out yet, but I'm sure over the summer I will be.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I think all these things do have knock-on effects, you know, and as you say, staff are also parents. So whatever schools do with children then impacts on the parents who are then your staff. So, you know, in a normal world, for example, we always try and make sure, you know, schools have the same school holidays and it's all sort of, you know, moves in lockstep, because as soon as that doesn't happen, it becomes very difficult for everyone.
Well, if we end up with several staff who've got different pickup times, I've still got children there, and if the primary schools or the secondaries can't do something where they can accommodate the special school staff at perhaps keeping them a little bit longer, we are in a really, really tricky situation. Safety.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Heather. And I mean, we're certainly trying to look to make it manageable for people. So by students arriving in different entrances and lining up in different areas, then, you know, trying not to make it difficult for.
Yeah, it's difficult though, because sometimes I think you finish at 2:45, don't you, Jill? So if our, you know, not necessarily your school, but if our staff then have to get there and I've still got more classes in September, I can't accommodate that with perhaps just shortening somebody's day, pupil-wise, because it's going to be linked with the buses, and we could have a really big issue.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's something we need to look at. We're trying to look at how the ends and beginnings of the day will work. So, because it's the same with siblings, you know, they've got a child in year 7 and year 10, and we're saying not really different start and end times. We're just going to anger parents. So we've got to try and make it sensible.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, it also shows where, you know, there's a limit to how far you can have bubbles which are in year groups, because some of your children will live with someone in a different bubble. You know, I mean, you know, you can only go so far these things, can't you?
Yeah.
But hey ho. All right, anything more from anyone on this? Okay. All right, I think we'll go back to you, Sue.
Any other business?
I've got one if anyone hasn't got anything. I'll do mine, then anyone can jump in then, shall I? Which is just, we've got SEN Contingency Fund was mentioned, I think, in sort of passing, in terms of one of the things we try and do supports mainstream schools. So one of the papers I think we distributed was showing the first term's allocation. And I should point out this is only now part of the contingency fund, because we have another half which is going to be intended to be on a sort of more of a case-by-case basis. I did speak to Simon Wellman a couple of days ago, and he was going to try, if he could, to put together some criteria for that for the form, but obviously he hasn't quite enough time to do that. But so we've got £100,000 which we distribute in the way we've done for a number of years, which, just as briefly recap, we look at schools' demographics, and if they've got significantly more SEN than demographics would suggest they, in quotation marks, should have, then we allocate some additional funds. And we look at it twice. We look at it once for the summer term, and then we look at it again for the autumn and the spring terms. £100,000 across the board is not a great amount of money, so most schools it's a sort of, you know, it's a sort of gesture of help rather than being something that's going to change the budgetary world. But as I say, we've sort of doubled the amount this year, and the other £100,000 we'll try and do more on a case-by-case basis. So in other words, if there's something about a particular school that this isn't really reflecting, or at least not in a way that is enough for the school to be not still severely hit, then there's another avenue for distributing the funds. So it will inevitably be less formulaic and more sort of individual to schools. As with all these things, there's arguments against that because it becomes a bit more subjective. But the arguments for that are that it's very difficult to capture every circumstance of an individual school in a formula. So we've sort of come to the view that we'll try and do a sort of compromise with half by the formula, half by this, and then we'll see how it goes. But as I say, it's now money that we didn't before put into this, so it isn't further support for mainstream schools that we are trying to keep going with despite the pressures elsewhere in high needs. Okay, that was me for that one. Has anyone else got any other AOB? Sorry, Sue, that should be you. Over to Sue. Sorry, I can always do that, don't I?
That's okay. I really don't mind. Yeah, I personally haven't got anything. Anyone else got any other business? No. It's back to you, Tim.
All right then. Well, thanks for sort of attending, folks. I mean, in some respects, I guess it's probably easy for you because you just switch on your computer, you know, sit in front of the computer for about 45 minutes, and then you switch me off again, and you can get back to your work. So you know, we have said we'll meet in real life next term, but some of you might think, oh, actually, given the prospect of having to trip off to Meeting Point House, this is quite good. I don't know. I think it is a bit different, isn't it, doing these meetings? They work okay up to points. I don't necessarily think you get quite the same interaction you do with a meeting in real life. So apologies that it's been a bit of a compromise form from that point of view. But obviously needs must. Next term, the assumption is we'll go back to a physical meeting. But as I say, as with everything else, we'll just have to see how circumstances are at the time.
Okay.
But thanks to all of you for coming along, and hope you found it useful a little bit at least. And if I don't see you before, hope you have a nice summer. And don't spend the entire summer trying to plan what the heck you're going to be doing in September around the government's rather vague guidance, which is more likely to be the case. So you at least have some sort of a break, because I appreciate, you know, for a lot of you, it's been real hard work to try and get things working in schools in, you know, unprecedented situation. So I'd imagine you probably do need a break, most of you. So hope you get it. All right then. Thanks, folks.
Thank
See
you
you all.
Thank you.
Again. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, mate.